I don't see that people who are tyrannical, power-mad exploiters actually do that well in our social institutions. And it also seems to me that it's a primary pleasure to open the door to people who have ability but less opportunity. Like it's a fundamental motivational pleasure for that to occur. And I think it's integrally related with the pleasure that people take in fatherhood.
Yeah, and I think that's completely right. And it needs to be said, well, a couple of things. The first is that this rich view of the individual as really mattering, as being connected intrinsically to to reality itself. Face en face de Dieu is one phrase that the French give us, face to face with God. But you see this in the ancient Greeks. You see this all throughout you see this developing in all sorts of ways throughout the institutions and philosophical, artistic movements of Western culture. I'm not saying not in other cultures, it's just that this is the tradition I know and to some level a scholar of. But the point I want to make twofold. First, that these ideas of the individual way predate the Enlightenment, and in many respects, the Enlightenment itself is, though responsible for many of our clarifications around these things, has also left us with many problems that we're, I think, going to have to face, or we're finished, really, fundamentally. But the second thing I want to say is that it's not that thinking about power is not important. I mean, there are very few things in the entire record of human beings thinking about what it means to be a human being, which is essentially what the humanities are, right? I mean, it's just the record of other people thinking about human experience throughout time, whether it's art or philosophy or theology or logic or architecture. I mean, these are the record of the ways in which people have grappled with what the human being is. That's all the humanities are, fundamentally. But at the heart of that, and there are few things more that occupy more bandwidth in that whole long arc of reflection than how one restrains the individual's own solipsism. It's the individual's own will to power, the individual's own, closed loop of the self against everything else, which it turns out, in this rich tradition of reflection, is an extremely bad thing for the individual to do, because it alienates.
Because that it's short-sighted, and it actually runs See, this is the problem with positing that the drive to power is the central animating principle, and to make a fundamental critique that might be expressed in such terms as systemic racism, let's say. I mean, that the drive to power and deceit, perhaps in the service of power, is best viewed as an aberration to the central tendency. A powerful aberration, and certainly the source of all the fundamental corruption of the central tendency, but it's not to be confused with the central tendency itself, which is more like properly construed, and I think that this is perhaps the central message of the Old Testament, properly construed as something like a benevolent father. I mean, the Greeks had their metaphysical reality too. I spoke with an author this week and a professor of classics at Boston University. The author is Brian Marescu, who wrote a book called The Immortality Key, and he was talking about the Eleusinian mysteries and the saturation of Greek culture in this underlying metaphysical religious reality that was manifested in the Eleusinian mysteries and in the Dionysian tradition as well. We talked a little bit about the transformation of the Dionysian into the Christian as a consequence of the union of Greek society and Jewish society. Out of that comes Christianity and this new conception of man as akin to divinity in some sense, or a recreation of that idea. I'm fumbling for words here, but I'm trying to get a picture of the central animating spirit, because what we're pushing out of the universities is the idea that we're fundamentally motivated by group-centered tyranny. And I don't believe that to be the case. I don't think that that's what good people are motivated by. And I don't think that bad people are particularly successful in our social institutions. I think that's an unbelievably cynical and dangerous way of looking at history. And it's also a way of looking at history that demolishes your own motivation, because if the central animating tendency of our social institutions is the expression of tyrannical power, then that's the defining characteristic of your own ambition. But if your own ambition is to develop yourself as a noble being who has a broad purview and who finds fundamental pleasure in serving the higher good, well, that's a whole different story. And the story is the critical thing here. And that's what the universities are supposed to be transmitting, is that central story. And if we're wrong about this, we're going to tear things down.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we need to say we're going to. I think in many respects we have already. Now, you were going to critique the Enlightenment. Well, I think we have already very deeply deconstructed many of the forms of life and culture that actually mediate the individual's agency and deeper realization. And we were saying a minute ago that if you look at things simply from the standpoint of power and you analyze individuals by that, I mean, the paradox is that if you tend only to your own power, you are a disaster. You are a disaster as a human being. You are a disaster in relation to others. You end up wildly unhappy and unfulfilled. I mean, that is simply a fact.
The path downward. In every level. It's not like you can be an individually successful psychopath exploiting everyone and end up hedonically advantaged without suffering. That isn't how it works. I've never seen that happen. I don't believe it's possible. And so I can't understand why we've bought the idea that power is the central animating principle. Like, what the hell? And why have it? There's an envy in it. There's an envy in it that I can't quite put my finger on. It's related in some sense to this. I've noticed that in the universities, whenever I worked with business people, for example, a lot of my peers would become upset with me. And I always wondered why that was, because my sense was, well, there was just as many good people and bad people in business, let's say, as there were good people and bad people in academia. And it was just completely foolish to draw an arbitrary line. But it had something to do with envy. And I was talking to Paul Rossi, the New York teacher who got nailed for standing up against the importation of critical race theory, let's say, into the private schools in New York. And he talked about the attraction that postmodern theory had for him when he was an undergraduate. He wanted to be a writer, but he didn't really have the talent as far as he was concerned. And along came the postmodern critics who were tearing literature apart, and they appealed to his resentment and his envy because they were tearing apart, an ideal he couldn't reach. And so it was very much reminiscent to me, for me, of the story of